My name is Mark Sox. This panel this afternoon, I know we'll have a few more people coming in, is going to look at an executive level of security in the critical infrastructure protection or CIP space. What I have on the panel I'll introduce in just a moment are three executives who have to worry about not just the ones and zeros part of it, but keeping their boards informed, worrying about fiduciary responsibility in some cases, liabilities, things that go well beyond just maintaining a firewall or an IDS or other things that have to do with traditional cybersecurity. So Ed Getz to my left is the CSO at Exelon, Exelon being an energy company. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in just a moment. To his left is Leo Taddeo, did I get that right? So I always have fun with names. Who's the CSO at CryptZone. And then one more over to the left is Joel Lankel, who's an ICS security subject matter expert at AECOM. My work is, I'm the Chief Security Officer or CSO at NERC. That's the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. We are a nonprofit that regulates the bulk power system here in the United States. So Ed and I both kind of have a similar background in terms of we're being in power. But critical infrastructures, whether it's telecom, aviation, financial services, we all tend to think the same way. So a lot of what we can talk about here today is going to be very, very relative to all the infrastructures. I'm going to sit down in just a moment, but before I do that, let's just recount a couple of events. Everybody's familiar with what happened yesterday, right, with the Dyn company and the DNS attacks. Were any of your organizations impacted by it? Anybody? It's okay, we're amongst friends, you could admit to that. Okay. Hopefully, your only impact was the fact that you were trying to use corporations that were impacted by it, that you yourself have multiple domain name server companies, that you're not just depending on one, but you've got many. These are the things that you have to think about at a leader level, is how are you doing your alternate communications, backups, other things, so that when bad does happen in one of your supplier channels, you have other channels to go for. That attack, we believe, is largely based on a large botnet that's made up of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of compromised Internet of Things, or IoT devices. Everybody knows what I'm talking about there? And that doesn't mean just necessarily SCADA, ICS kind of control system things, but also includes devices in your home, like cameras, digital video recorders, alarms, switches, things that you've been buying at Home Depot and Best Buy and Lowe's or Amazon or wherever you're getting, even your little Alexa device for those who have the Echo thing from Amazon. Those are all IoT devices. They are all compromisable, and that's what is contributing to this very interesting phenomenon we've seen now in the last several weeks, the building of botnets from IoT devices. Something that is real, and we have to think about and address at an executive level. What policies in your corporation address this explosion of IoT, and are you set up for an internal IoT problem as well as a possible attack on IoT devices elsewhere? We've seen ransomware. Everybody's probably familiar with that. Corporations that get hit with email attachments that are just generally sprayed at the employees of a corporation, hoping that just one will open the attachment, give the bad guy a toehold, and now they've got access through crypto-locking malware to perhaps come asking for a ransomware check. Or they get in through phishing with an attachment. It's not ransomware, but it's to gain a toehold, gain some access to collect keystrokes, collect login data. Everybody's probably familiar with the Ukraine incident that happened back in December of last year, where 3 Ukrainian power companies had their power literally turned off by a remote actor who had broken in. Our investigation showed that started about 9 months earlier with a phishing attack. Not a ransomware attack, but just attachments going to employees. Some employees opened it. That allowed the adversaries to gain access, find usernames and passwords, and then use that to gain remote access into the control systems. This is not a very technical problem. It requires leadership. It requires a rethinking of a security culture. How do we go into this? How do we attack it? So I'm going to have a seat here in just a second, but I'll allow my panelists to talk a little bit about very kind of high-level thoughts, and we'll kind of drill in a little bit to some of these bigger, deeper, tougher subjects. And I do want to allow time at the end, the last maybe 20, 25 minutes or so, for audience questions. So please start thinking of your tough questions. We'll have a microphone we can pass around. And I think a lot of times the panels work best if we're interactive with everybody and we kind of come to some goodness. So Ed, let me start with you a little bit about yourself and your thoughts on executive level cybersecurity management and what you need to do as a CSO.
Sure. Thanks very much, Marcus. I think what I'd like to do is start out by talking a little bit about Exelon, and then you'll understand why we approach things the way we do. So Exelon is the largest producer of nuclear energy in the United States. We control approximately 25% of all the nuclear power generated in the U.S. In addition to that, we own 6 very large utilities. We own ComEd in Chicago, we own PECO in Philadelphia, Baltimore Gas and Electric, and we just acquired PEPCO and 2 of its subsidiary utilities. In addition to that, we own every type of generation that exists. We're in 48 states, as well as the UK and in South America. So we were just added to the Fortune 100 list last week. We are the only electric company among the Fortune 100 companies right now. We provide electricity to over 10 million residential customers. Almost every light bulb between Northern Virginia and New York City is owned by an Exelon company. And I think it's important to understand that, because then you'll understand how important we view the threats to our company. Our board of directors, our CEO, understand that it's not just a matter of continuing the revenue for the company. They view this, I view this, as a national security matter for our country. Some of our biggest customers, Washington, D.C. area, Baltimore area, critical assets for our country. And so we go the extra mile in how we approach security. I'm responsible for all of security within Exelon. That includes both cyber and physical. For those of you who understand the electric sector, and Marcus is one of our regulators, there's a set of standards called the NERC-CIP standards. And those are requirements on the electric sector to protect our cyber and physical assets to a certain standard. We believe at Exelon that that is a baseline, right? That's the minimum bar that you have to achieve. And we go way beyond those standards because we recognize the importance of the company and the commitment that we have to our country. So that's the way we view it, Marcus.
Very good, thank you. All right, let's shift over to Leo.
Thank you. My name's Leo Taddy. I'm CSO for a cybersecurity company. So we have, as a cybersecurity company, a couple of challenges. First of all, everyone in the company is a cybersecurity expert, just about. So talking cybersecurity with folks who do it every day and build tools for it is a challenge for the chief security officer. The second thing that makes it a little easier is they all understand the value of security. So convincing them that putting security processes in place, convincing them that it's necessary isn't such a high bar for me. But I want to echo some of the things that Ed said about the importance of power and other critical infrastructure and how they come together. In my prior career, I was the special agent in charge of cyber and special operations in New York, and in addition to electricity, there were other sectors that underpin the New York infrastructure, and sitting on top of subways and communications and water delivery systems is the financial sector resources that are in the area. And if you think about the types of attacks and the types of vulnerabilities that our adversaries are looking at, top of list is probably the financial sector. So from a law enforcement and government point of view, each individual sector is important. Each has known and unknown interdependencies, and getting them to talk to one another was a significant challenge for me. Many times security professionals take some are collaborative, some are not, depending on the culture of the organization and the sector that they come out of. But I think as we study the issue and how we can be better at it, we not only have to think about the verticals, but also the cross-division and cross-sector cooperation and communication. And that, to me, as was demonstrated during a TTX in May of 2014 is one of the biggest challenges. Many times information that's important for the entire city stays within a particular organization or even within a vertical, and getting them to share across is tough because of the vulnerabilities and potential liabilities that they'll expose. So breaking those down, I think, is, as professionals, that's our job on a daily basis, getting past the idea that we could be liable for sharing information when in fact we probably have a collective security posture that depends on that sharing. So with that,
Thank you, Leo.
thanks.
Joel?
Well, my name is Joel Angelo. So I feel honored to be on an executive panel. I'm not an executive. I'm a very seasoned engineer. I've been an engineer my whole life, and I'm an automation and control engineer. So the infamous ICS SCADA conversations, I'm usually one of the guys in the back that kind of gets heated up about these. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of misinterpretation. There's a lot of bad press. There's a lot of hype that doesn't really correlate to really where the threats lie. So everything that when I consult with people, from 1990 to 2010, my job was building the world's critical infrastructure. So I was an automation and control engineer that was basically being pushed out of airplanes in all of the developing countries in the world, helping build oil refineries in countries like Vietnam, developing the Orinoco Valley in Venezuela, revamping the power infrastructure in Egypt, putting in most of the major automation infrastructure in most of the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. So my background comes from how these systems are actually deployed. And what really makes me a threat to a lot of people is that knowing how these systems are actually put together, you're able to actually do an awful lot of damage without ever taking advantage of a single vulnerability. So I don't know if you saw the last meeting, the last panel with Melissa Hathaway. I kind of had a little bit of a disagreement with her regarding vulnerabilities. And the main reason is that just because you can attack a particular component in a critical infrastructure, there are so many checks and balances that, in order to really do, you want to establish command and control, or you want to actually accomplish something. A typical denial of service really isn't one of the big concerns for us. Being able to actually do something catastrophic, so I was pretty much raised in the oil business. We typically refer to those events as when things go wrong in an oil refinery, they go boom. And usually whenever there's a boom, there's a lot of people that die. So the idea is to understand security, not from an information security point of view, but from an operational security point of view. Because I am not there to secure the control system. I'm there to secure the billion-dollar asset that control system is actually operating. And that's where a lot of the challenge, and we'll probably get through these as we start talking, lies, is that people are trying to solve operational security problems with information security tools. And that's why they're not effective. So I got into security in about 2005, which is when the industry was full on in a Windows infrastructure, right? We started to make the transition in the late 90s. It took a while. We go slow in industrial. And the main reason is that once those plants start up, they never shut down. So systems have to be tried and proven and reliable and resilient and so on. So coming into security, I was motivated to work more in cyber because of the work I did around safety. I was a functional safety engineer. So those are the systems that are really a small piece of the ICS scope, but they're the real police of most process and plant facilities. So for instance, in electric generation, you usually need to make steam. So safety systems would be on boilers in order to prevent the boiler from ever overpressuring and exploding. Safety systems are everywhere. So the idea was to actually start to combine safety and security. And that's where we really have found the culture for safety is always the top of most industrial companies' list. Most companies today do have safety metrics, but the problem is we don't see that with security. So my background and my motivation with people is to try to show them how to leverage the way we think about safety to the way we think about security. You don't take a paper clip and stick it into an electrical outlet. You may have when you were a kid and you got kicked and it hurt and you never did it again. But people's cyber hygiene is appalling in some cases. So I always do it on airplanes, right? I get on a plane, I turn on my Cali, and I see what stupid things people are doing. And sure enough, I will always find somebody with connections to a bank. They're doing their banking on an airplane Wi-Fi that's wide open, right? They're not running any kind of encryption on those networks. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of the ideas that we're going to kind of talk about with the underlying issues of critical infrastructure.
Well, let's go ahead and I'm going to keep you on the hot seat for just a minute.
Uh-oh.
Let's talk IoT. Talk about that earlier. You're an SME in the ICS SCADA world. Granted, ICS and SCADA does not equal IoT, but there's a lot of intersection there. Is the growth of IoT a problem? Have we crossed a line that we cannot go backwards on? Or do executives need to rethink? I mean, if you were briefing these guys as execs, what do they need to know about the Internet of Things? Is it a threat to their business, to their organization, to their customers, to America? Or is it just another natural wave of technology that's not going to really cause much more than just inconvenience if there's issues?
Well, we know IoT is going to take off, right? I mean, it's starting to show up in more ways than you could possibly imagine. Now, for me, being an engineer, I love technology, but I also like to have technology that serves a purpose. So, also being an engineer that now is in security, and I don't like to put cyber in front of it because to truly have a good holistic security approach, you do need to blend physical security and logical security, right? Because without good physical security, most of your assets are vulnerable to far greater risks than a cyber attack. So the IoT concept's kind of funny because we look, and I work a lot, I was a technical editor on a book called Applied Security in the Smart Grid. And one of the things we talked about was people are deploying technologies without actually thinking about the consequences. And probably the best one that I see on TV now is the $9,000 Samsung refrigerator that'll take pictures. And it'll send them to your phone via an email account. So me being a cyber guy goes, that is probably the worst thing you could ever put in a home. Because it may tell you when you need to get milk, but it's also going to tell a bad guy when there's nobody in the home. Because the refrigerator is not going to change, right? So IoT is going to impact our lives. But when I go inside the fence, when I'm inside facilities, I tend to look at it different. We really have been doing IoT since we implemented digital field instrumentation in the 90s. So the technology we started deploying, we've had digital field networks and wireless infrastructure in manufacturing facilities for quite some time. So for us, we're already massively networked. So the IIoT, I think, is kind of somebody trying to create a marketing opportunity versus really going out and looking and saying, yes, we have IP connected.
But at a leader level for
That's
these
right.
guys, what do they need to do?
They need
Ban it? Should they adopt it? Where do you go if you're advising a board, for example, or you're advising your general counsel, or somebody's saying we want to adopt this really cool new technology? What do I do, Ed? What advice would you give?
the one thing that people, and that we're seeing even, we should be very mature in cyber in 2016, 2017. The one thing we're not seeing is a widespread adoption of procurement standards around security. So when the first thing, when I go in and talk to, I like to start with the security heads and the finance heads. Because usually the CFO in that organization tends to own risk. Security is all about risk management, and in any facility, lots of risk. But the idea is that we have to start making purchasing decisions based not only on functionality, but safe, reliable, secure operation. And there's a lot of guidelines and documents that exist, but it is shocking to see that people aren't using it. So for me, I always say, are you willing to change the way you buy goods and services?
Well, Ed, how do you think about that? Is it a supply chain problem, or is there more to IoT that we need to worry about as a senior leader?
Yeah, I think going back to where we were with ICS systems 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think it's in parallel with where we are in IoT today. So when the SCADA systems, the industrial control systems were designed, They weren't designed to be connected to the internet. They weren't designed for security. We're living with that now because they are connected in many ways to the internet. So a lot of the IoT things that we see today were designed the same way, without any security baked in at the beginning. So now we're living with the same kind of issue. I think, and Joel sort of hit on this, is we need some standards around the supply chain and hold manufacturers accountable for baking in security from the very beginning. And that means secure coding, maybe not to the highest standard, but at least a medium level of security rather than just sloppy coding and having all of these IoT items vulnerable to some very basic exploitation.
Do we need an act of Congress?
I don't know if we need more regulation. I'm not a big regulation guy, but I would say that the market could help drive that if people understood the threats. That could help drive the standards for the marketplace.
So, David, how does law enforcement fit into all this? Is there an angle here, a play, something that executives need to think about where law enforcement can help, or is that?
Well, before I go into the law enforcement part, just a perspective on executive view of IoT and other security issues. So the boards and the CEOs, CFOs I've talked to are held to a standard of mitigating risk against cost. And it's really making a business case for the security solution. So I've talked to retail CISOs about the potential for their data loss, and some of them respond saying, look, we've calculated the cost of losing X number of credit card and PII, and it costs Y. But fixing it costs 2Y. So we've decided we're going to mitigate this risk best we can, but we're not going to spend 2Y. And that, I think, goes to all of the security decisions, basically all decisions that they're programmed to do a cost-benefit analysis and say, are we spending more to fix a problem than
There's no
the problem
perfect
itself?
solution, or no perfect security.
No, I think it goes back to the supply chain question and what consumers and enterprises are using to make purchase decisions. And what they're using are features and functionality and price and not security yet. So that might change. We're seeing some of that change in consumer selection of personal communications devices. Sometimes security features can be the distinguisher in a person's purchase decision. But we're not necessarily seeing it all across the board everywhere we want to see it. And when we look at a $9,000 refrigerator, the consumer's not necessarily thinking security and privacy. They're thinking, wow, that's really neat, that's better than my neighbor's. And that's going to drive spending for the individual purchaser and for boards. It's really not top of mind and top of consideration when purchase decisions are made, whether it's for a SCADA system or whether it's for a refrigerator. So until that changes, we're going to be, as security professionals, chasing the threat and chasing the vulnerabilities against those types of purchases.
It's a new type of exposure, certainly. We've had an earlier generation, as you point out, but there's new changes here, new exposure that boards in particular are not ready for. We at our level have got to educate them and try and help them with that decision making.
Yeah, they're all about, do I need to be best in class? Do I need to do what my competitor is doing? And can I get away with doing less than my competitor is doing, because that gives me an advantage?
Right.
And that's the strict business analysis that folks are doing. The boards are not populated by security professionals. They're populated by business people who have to answer to investors and answer for this money that they're spending. So I think security rises and falls on their radar, and that's when it becomes, maybe they'll free up money for it, but the kinds of measures that you're talking about, a full-blown supply chain procurement process, is expensive. And it takes a lot of people and expertise. It slows down business operations. And when you go before a board and say, I want you to stop the rollout of a new marketing campaign because the database you're using isn't properly secured, the CMO is going to kick you in the teeth and say that's not going to happen because we've spent a lot of money on that process. So you're not, as we can't consider security in a vacuum, is my point. You have to consider the entire business operation and how security factors in as one of many costs to the operation.
And it's certainly a challenge as a chief security officer to get to yes, because oftentimes your reaction is no. Somebody wants to do some new idea, no, that's not secure, stop here. I know way too many security professionals who have found new employment because they said no too often, versus trying to figure out how to get to yes.
See, another challenge that we have, and that I've seen in many cases, and it's always nice when you go to a conference and somebody talks about how they were able to successfully fund and deliver a security program, is people fail to understand that at the C level of an organization and that core group of individuals plus the board of directors, they have a lot of risk on their plate. And cyber is only one of those risks. And one thing that we always reinforce is the importance early to do proper risk classification and understand your acceptable tolerance. Because there are people that think that just because I have a vulnerable piece of software or some vulnerable asset, that I have to turn around and upgrade and replace it. In reality, that's not necessarily the case, because that may be one problem, but we also have a huge contract with our labor union that's up. And trust me, that is an immediate direct threat to the bottom line, where this is a perceived maybe something will happen threat. So one of the biggest challenges has always been to go in and understand the big picture. And that's why I'm glad that I heard somebody in the energy business kind of be a little resistant to more regulation. That's where I see a lot of the regulations and standards falling short, is they try to create a one-size-fits-all model. And our businesses, though they may appear similar, our risk tolerance and our whole methodology are very different. It can be based on the state you're in or the country and the world you're in, for instance.
So you're raising some interesting obstacles to security. So let me just shift gears a bit. I'll start with you. Are there non-technical obstacles that keep us from being secure? And this is all over the map, of course. There's legal, there's HR, there's unions, contracts. In your organization or your experience, is there a single obstacle that's probably worse than anything else? Or what stops you from being secure? Because you'd love to just wave the wand and say, let's just do it this way.
Right. Well, I think Leo hit on it. It's risk management, right? We could spend ourselves into bankruptcy, and so while we want to be secure, there has to be an acceptable risk level there. And so we're constantly weighing that in our industry, but especially at Exelon, because while we want to go beyond that NERC bar that I described earlier, and we do, there comes a point where we can't recover a lot of the costs that we're expending. So we have to constantly weigh that. I don't see any resistance in Exelon to increasing security. Everybody understands that the threat is continuing to increase. I go back to my opening statement that Exelon views this as a national security matter. And so the company is full of what I would describe as patriots, right? Whether it's the guy climbing the pole or it's somebody in the boardroom, right? All of those people are true patriots, and they understand the threats. They want to do the right thing. And all we have to do is educate them. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been successful in getting the support that we've gotten in the company, is because we've been able to convince the board, convince the CEO that the threat is real, and we need to up our game on a continuous basis. We call it continuous improvement in all areas, right? Whether it's in our operational performance or whether it's in security. So that all fits together in one risk view for the company. And I can tell you that we have 12 risks that the board has identified as the top 12 risks. Cybersecurity is right up there. So every board meeting, I have to come in and talk. I am the only one in the company who presents at every board meeting, and they're quarterly. So that gives you some indication of how important the board views security for excellence.
And the risk, yeah. Leo, what about you? What barriers keep you from being as secure as you'd like to be?
Ongoing business processes that can't be interrupted just to implement a security feature or process. So you can't stop your salespeople from entering the system the way they normally do, whether they're VPNing in from a managed device or from their own device.
Right.
And you can't say we're not doing that anymore, because then they won't be able to sell, and then you won't have revenue and you won't get paid at the end of the week. So the primary obstacle is integrating additional security measures while still allowing the business to process and to operate. And for a small organization, it's a challenge. I can only imagine what it's like for something like Ed's operation, where he's in 48 states and he's got hundreds of thousands of assets and people to protect. Trying to roll out a change in procedure to make a process or an asset more secure has got to be an enormous challenge at that scale. But for me, even at a smaller scale, convincing business people every day that what they're doing needs to alter or change is tough. It is really hard.
So Joel, what works then? We talked a little bit about barriers and obstacles.
I was ready to talk about barriers.
Oh, no. Let's put a little better spin on it. What does work? Are there controls? Are there features? Are there business processes? Are there things that do work?
Oh, that's a tough one. So I do a lot of assessments for a variety of different kinds of companies, and typically they can be very simple vulnerability-based assessments or very comprehensive risk-based assessments. And for the companies that seem to score well, they actually have looked at security from a true 360-degree point of view. What doesn't work are people that think they can go to some supplier and buy a technological solution that's going to solve all the world's problems. They typically do solve all the world's problems today, but they offer very little resilience. If you look at what most attacks start with, it's someone doing something wrong. So people don't think about antivirus, the human antivirus, right? So you look at the matrix, you could plug those probes into the back of your head and you could probably program that in. But today the companies that are doing very well have kind of taken standards and pushed them to the side of the table, have looked at their overall risk, and have decided to pick a core set of controls and procedural issues to address security. Things like training and awareness. We have to do safety training. Most companies, it's mandatory. It's nice that my new employer actually has security awareness newsletters that come out. So people are being exposed to the problem, they're learning what to do and what not to do. And what I think is working the most, and again, when we score and we rate people's overall posture, those that take it from a procedural point of view first tend to have far more secure systems, right? Because they actually are looking at the true source of all problems, not at a second or third level consequence of that particular problem, right? So whether it's black energy and how the payloads were in email attachments, okay, so it's the ability to manage and monitor that has to start procedurally, and then you can put technological type solutions on top.
I'll just add to that a little bit, Joel. What we say in security at Exelon is every time an employee logs on, they're either an asset or a liability, right? And so what we've done is we have educated them, but then we test them on a regular basis with campaigns across the enterprise that are done at random, but they're also done against repeat offenders. And what we've seen, and we measure this, is how that education and how those testing campaigns that we run against our employees affect the number of malware infections, right? And the types of malware infections. And what we've seen is a decline over the last year in the number of malware infections that we've gotten into our network through employee actions. And so we can show that what we're doing is actually being effective and very cost effective too, because we measure that against what is the remediation efforts. Every time we have to go out and grab somebody's machine and do a mirror image of it and look at it forensically and give them a new unit while we take that offline, what's the cost against the few $1,000s that we've invested to test people and hold them accountable? So even repeat offenders have action taken against them now by their supervisors. So that's a way that you can truly show what you're doing is being effective. It's good.
So I'm going to start with the principle that as executive security officials, successful senior security officials are business people first and security officials second. You have to think like your business partners in the company in order to be successful at the executive level. And so from that point of view, when I look at the possibility of spending on training and security awareness and spending on technology, I look at it from a business point of view and say, my company didn't hire this person to be security aware, they didn't pay this person today to do security training, how can I reduce that? And my view is, I want to buy technology that makes it hard for my employee to do things that are dangerous for the company. I want to configure my architecture, I want to look for security in the equipment and IT infrastructure that I'm handing to this employee. I want to make it, we used to call it in the Bureau, we used to call it agent-proof. In the military, it's marine-proof or soldier-proof. I want to configure my organization so that I can reduce the cost of training and security awareness so that my folks can get back to doing the primary job I hired them to do, whether that's sell, market, do customer relationships. Every day that they're spending training on security is a day they're not earning revenue for my company. So from a business point of view, that's the way your colleagues around the business table think of it. When you propose these things, they're saying, I don't want to give you 2 hours of my sales staff time so you can do training. Figure out a way to do your job without involving my resources, taking people away from the job that I need them to do. So as you sit as a senior executive in a corporate environment, you're going to be tested, whether expressly and openly or through whispers and rumbling, that what you're doing is costing the company money. So you've got to factor that in when you come up with your security strategy and when you compare the benefits of training and security and how much of it you need with investments in the type of technology or processes that reduce that need.
So when you say soldier-proof, that resonates with a lot of us. I'm retired Army or Marine-proof or agent-proof or whatever. But what you're pointing out is workforce. The employees of the companies that provide critical infrastructure capability across the country. So there is a human side to this. It's not all about ones and zeros, but the actual employees are part of this. I want to know kind of what your take on where we stand in America with employees, humans, being part of the problem or part of the solution. Workforce is what I'm looking at. As executives, how do you work with HR? How do you talk that talk about making sure we're actually recruiting people that know what's going on? Or do we have a problem across not just America but other countries where we can't recruit the talent that we need? Is there a gap there that may be widening faster than technology is getting more complex? And what's the role of business and critical infrastructure owners when it comes to that workforce development? I'll just start with you, Ed.
So I'd like to comment a little bit about the remarks that Leo just made, and I think you have to differentiate between companies in the critical infrastructure area and other companies, especially ours. So while a company that Leo may deal with would have that resistance in their culture, that's not the same in the critical infrastructure, especially in the energy sector. So we build in training hours to every employee's 2,080 hours that they're responsible to work per year. So that's baked into how much the cost is. We want that training, whether it's safety or security. So it's a little bit different depending on the type of company that you're dealing with along those lines, how much resistance you're going to meet. So I would say, back to your question, Marcus, yes, I think it's a challenge to find, recruit, and retain top talent in the cybersecurity area right now. We've been very fortunate because people come to the company, they recognize that it's an important issue for the company, their opinions are valued, and they feel like they're contributing to a greater good. So we have a lot of retired, former military people, other government agencies. The IC is all represented in my organization, and so they continue that mission. And that's the way we are able to attract good people, that we pay them pretty well, but they also know that their opinions are valued. So you have to create that atmosphere where they understand that there's a great mission, their opinions are valued, and they're highly compensated for what they do. And that's kind of a self-licking ice cream cone, because then they go out and recruit people for you, right? They say, hey, this is a great place to work, and a lot of it is done by word of mouth, but that's not a good process, right, for sustaining forever, right? Because that ice cream cone eventually melts, right? So what we do is we go out and partner with the universities, and even down to the middle school level right now. We're sponsoring STEM programs at all of those different levels. We bring students in and give them the opportunity to intern with us. And then we are helping some of the big universities, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, tremendous STEM program, great program in cybersecurity. We partner with Hopkins, where I'm a graduate from. And so we're working at that high level, but all the way down to that tactical level. And I'll throw out a plug for a small company called Life Journey. And Life Journey, the CEO is Rick Garretts. And what they do is partner with schools and give students the opportunity all the way down at the middle school level to participate in the day in the life of somebody who is in a field that they're interested in. And most of those are in the STEM fields. So if you are in one of those fields and you're willing to allow Life Journey to come in and just view your daily activities, they will then partner you with a student who you can mentor, can be anywhere in the country. And there are exercises that go along with this for the student. There are challenges in there, how they would go about overcoming these obstacles. Now, I'm not sure that Rick has partnered with anybody in the military yet, but I would say it's been very successful in our area.
Yeah, so I think there are two trends that I'm interested in the HR world. And I'm talking about the insider threat. Starting with, in my view, and I think in a lot of professionals' view, the best point in preventing an insider threat from entering your company is at the hiring process and doing proper screening. That's becoming more and more difficult with regulations and the different statutes that are being passed in what you can do to check the background of an employee before you hire them. So conducting criminal background checks is pretty much off the table. Credit checks are coming off the table in most jurisdictions. And what you can do with that information and how you're limited in using it to form a hiring decision is subject to a lot of compliance, a lot of litigation. It's very expensive to make mistakes in that area these days, and companies are hiring people that they shouldn't. They can't dig deeper and they can't go on factors that they can't. So I think the insider threat is getting tougher because the culture and the regulatory environment is making it harder for employers to make that type of determination at the critical point of hiring. The second trend, and I think the jury's still out on it, is whether our workforce is becoming more aware and whether that's having an effect on security. So the media attention to the cybersecurity problem and the individual focus on it is good for companies because it gets people to do the right thing, and cyber hygiene is easier to teach, it's easier to keep top of mind. But at the same time, social engineering is becoming more effective, more money is being invested in very, very sharp, focused, and strategic social engineering. So I think there's an arms race between what we can train our employees and the awareness that we can provide to them and the very skillful social engineers who are attacking them. So that I think the jury's still out. Just the last comment on that awareness point of view. I traveled here with a colleague of mine to Israel a few years back, and it's remarkable the security culture there because unfortunately they have a severe threat.
Well, it's existential.
It's in their midst, it's at their borders and in almost every corner of the country. And that focuses them at an early age on security, not just for themselves, but collectively. So what you notice in Israel when it comes to security is that they feel responsible, of course, for themselves, but there's also a sense that their actions individually could have a negative impact on the entire organization, and they're co-national. And so they take it very seriously. I don't think we're at that point yet. Unfortunately for 9/11, we've gotten more aware. You see the see something, say something campaigns, and people are more receptive to that. But we need to, unfortunately, in the environment, I think, get a little better as individuals understanding how our actions affect not just ourselves, but the entire organization, people around
And the
us.
country ultimately.
Yeah.
So, and that's interesting that you bring up that point about the difficulty in being able to do background checks. Because, I mean, most of the people in this room, right, for me to go in your facility, you have a very rigorous process, right? It takes months, years. So, the Homeland Security Industrial Control System Joint Working Group, they just had their semi-annual meeting a few weeks back down in Florida. We sat around with some power co-op people, and we got into one of these discussions over lunch, and they presented me with their problem and how they properly could vet potential security consultants and advisors. Because when we go in front of a client, you have to realize as soon as we start looking at your security posture, we really do have very threatening information about a particular organization. So what I helped them develop was kind of this checklist. I mean, I know I go over the edge because if it's not government, then they could care less about top secret clearances. But I always have in my normal portfolio of information a regular FBI background check that's done, various other types of background checks. I'm working with the city of New York, and to do anything for them, I mean, New York is really setting the bar for really how I think a city should be run in terms of security. We actually had to go through a special security clearance strictly for the city of New York, which is a security access credential. It's kind of like their version of a TWIC, if you're familiar with the TWIC card, the Transportation Worker Identification Credential. So they have the same idea in New York. And I'm really in favor of that. I think that people should have to be vetted, that they're not the insider, right? Because, you know, we've got some internal bets. You're never supposed to mention Stuxnet at a conference. But if you look at Stuxnet, Stuxnet was an insider attack. Shamoon was an insider attack, right? In order to get that thing started, you needed to be inside an organization. Now, whether it's counter-espionage or somebody that you could offer a small sum of money, but to that person is a lot of money, to have them do the simple little USB in one computer, and as you saw in Saudi Arabia what happened, it was rather significant. Sure. So I'm a big believer in understanding who's touching assets. And one other kind of flip side example of a company that I thought was going the wrong direction, it's a big multinational pharmaceutical company that I was contracted with, and they chose to outsource their Active Directory management to a third party. Now, everybody knows that the key to the kingdom is Active Directory. If you've ever done penetration testing, you want those credentials, because as soon as you have credentials, you need no more vulnerabilities. So when I asked them, and we're kind of doing a high-level corporate, director-level question and answer session, I said, can you tell me right now at 2:10 on Saturday, who has administrative access to your global infrastructure? And they couldn't. So I said, can we call the third-party supplier and ask them? They couldn't either. That's a problem. That's a problem. And that's the idea when we start talking about knowing who has the ability and understanding the screening. Because what happens is you don't know if that person's across the street or across the ocean. And obviously the risk exposure is very different depending on where those people reside.
And you're touching on that grand theory of the unknown unknowns.
The unknown
All
unknowns.
those things we don't know about. And speaking of unknown, it is unknown to me how many of you have questions. And I would like to take that unknown off of my list. Let's shift it to the audience. And you now know a little bit about us. I believe there's a microphone. Is that correct, Mr. Microphone over here? And I will let you arbitrate who has speaking privileges since you own the microphone.
Good afternoon. Which would be the greater catalyst to provide incentives to ensuring security? A government regulation and standard scheme for minimal compliance similar to vehicle safety regulations, or a looser regulatory structure, but an active plaintiffs bar that is bringing suits against your company for loss of customer data and for other things?
And to reduce our confusion, is there any particular person you'd like to have answer that question? I'll ask that of everybody. Just direct it to a person.
I see a wide swath of opinions and approaches in your organizations to how government regulation fits in with your scheme of security. It's a critical factor for the engineering sector, so they have to have that built in because it goes along with safety, to business, which is making a risk finance decision on security, to other wells. So that it would go across the board.
Yeah, I'll start, Marcus. So the electric industry is the most regulated industry in the United States. Right? We have very stringent regulations. But I think the real driver for us is more of doing the right thing. But the other impetus is, of course, legal action, right? Have you done your due diligence? Have you used best practices? Those are the real drivers. Yes, we comply with the regulations. But again, that's just the baseline. Doing the right thing means going beyond that. And if there are best practices out there that are beyond those regulations, you should be doing those too to help mitigate litigation potential.
So two things to consider. One is government regulation and whether or not that's adding any security value. When I was still at the FBI, I can tell you that there were, in my office, 0 cases of network intrusions of law firms in my area of responsibility. Now that means one of 3 things. They have figured out cybersecurity in a way that no one else has. 2, they're breached and they don't know it. 3, they're breached, they know it, and they don't want anybody to. And the reason why they were able to not report it, and obviously it's number 3, they've been breached, they probably have some clue about it, and they're not telling anybody. It's bad for business for a law firm to be breached, so they don't tell anybody about it. And the reason they don't tell anybody about it is that there's no regulatory requirement for law firms. They're not publicly traded for the most part. Most of them are partnerships. And I practiced law for a while, so I'm kind of familiar with the culture. They're not carrying a lot of PII, so they usually don't trigger Attorney General requirements that they, when they lose data, it's not generally PII data that they're losing their clients' privileged. And there's no ethical requirement, depending on how you read the attorney ethics guidelines. You are obligated as an attorney not to disclose the information to a third party, but there's nothing in the regulations, at least up about a year ago, that says you're required to keep somebody from stealing it from you. So that's why lawyers don't report their breaches, and it's bad because we have no visibility on the problem because no one's forcing them to report. I think that principle would apply across other sectors, but for regulation. So while I'm not big proponent of regulation. I think it's necessary to set some minimum standards. You can go too far, and I think in some ways we have gone too far, but I think it has to have some teeth, and you have to have some regulations in place, otherwise we would be completely blind across all sectors. The second point is the Plaintiffs Bar. Now, there's a lot of complaining about the Plaintiffs Bar, but our child cribs and strollers are safer because of the consumer product law that comes out of litigation. Our automobiles are safer because of litigation. And we all benefit from that. It's kind of an unseen benefit that comes at a very visible cost, and that is high jury verdicts and sometimes companies going out of business. But again, I think there's a definite role for someone to advocate for the consumer when a company like Wyndham or others don't take enough time and effort to protect that consumer data. So they both government and the Plaintiffs Bar, in my view, play an important role. It can be overdone, but we wouldn't have the kind of safety, you get on a ladder today and it's safer than it was 50 years ago because of that type of litigation. So I think there is something to it, and we have to respect that role of government, respect the role of the Plaintiffs Bar, but also keep an eye on what it's actually costing companies and perhaps regulate the regulators at some point.
Julie?
This is a good topic, and I've really enjoyed the dialogue so far. So to start, I am very against regulation. So I was a vendor for about 20 years, 18 years. And the problem is that there is zero global consistency on regulations. So for instance, we take a look at what France is trying to do. I just moved back to the US after being a resident of Luxembourg for a little over 3 years. And France actually has some documentation that's out that leads you down a path that they are going to mandate certification of specialized security equipment to be deployed within the critical infrastructure of France. Okay, so what are you going to do? So France now, they're not going to accept anybody else's. You actually have to go through their regulations and their certification process. So then what if you want to sell it in Germany? They're likely going to do something similar. So all of a sudden, you're going to put an enormous burden on people making products. So two things can happen. The price of those products will become unaffordable, or people will just say we're choosing not to do business in that particular country. As you can see, both options are a loser for the end user, right? So the person in the very end is the one that's going to kind of come out the short end of the stick. So for me, as we go from the boardroom down to the plan again, I work in industries that all industries use the same basic equipment. You know, you're probably familiar with a PLC, a programmable logic controller. Those products can be deployed in tens of thousands of different ways. They're just a simple device that's meant to do automated control. So there are those people that believe that it should be secured, but not everybody wants to secure it. So I like the car example that was mentioned. We still kill more people in car accidents than anything else in the United States. Intentionally, right? So of course there's natural disease and things like that. But so why doesn't everybody in the United States drive a fortified car like the President of the United States does? It would probably reduce that number dramatically. But how many people could afford a fortified car that's got armor-plated doors and side panels and bulletproof glass? I mean, you could run into that car and nothing would happen, right? So we've got this whole cost of security versus balancing risk and reward. So that's why I really try to stay away from these groups that want to say that we're going to give some stamp to some product and say it's secure. Because the fear I would have for that, and it's interesting with the law analogy, companies that are regulated, when I'm hired to do an audit against the regulations, the specific rules of engagement say, if you find something we don't want to know, only tell us where we do not comply with the regulation. That is a very dangerous position they're in. But many people, even the financial sectors, are starting to take this approach, because if something goes wrong and they do what the government told them to do, then they can't be held liable. So I'm very scared at what's happening with regulations. Now, in the energy sector, it is a privilege to work with companies that have taken the baseline and gone way above it. But we have this problem with too much regulation is going to cause people to start figuring out ways to do things the wrong way.
They gain the regulations.
It is the regulation.
Let me, one other little comment on that, and we'll go to the next question. At NERC, my parent corporation, we have what are called reliability standards. So they're not regulations, but they're enforceable standards. This is something that the power companies themselves have developed. Electrical engineers and others have recognized this is the baseline for reliable power, and they're enforceable. We argue very strongly that we don't want technical, prescriptive standard regulations and whatnot because it forces everybody to do the same thing. This is a theory that says diversity is a strength. So imagine a situation where NERC or the government or others actually had full-blown technical specs that says if you're going to install widget X, it must conform to this very rigid set of technical specifications. Everybody now installs widget X, and it turns out widget X has a vulnerability, and we're sunk because everybody's doing it the same way. The primary evidence of this is Ukraine. As we investigated last year with what happened, those oblanergos, as they're called, are on the old Soviet model, of which everybody did the same thing. Everybody followed the same list. They installed everything exactly the same way. And when one falls, they all fall. That is a huge strength in North America, is to allow infrastructure owners the flexibility to be diverse, but stay within a framework, or say an outcome-based framework. So I think there's a lot of room for really good discussion here, but we definitely do not want a rigid regulatory environment because it will make us brittle, and in the end we fail if that happens. So where's our next question?
Hi, I'm Todd Key. I'm the chairman of Strategic Research Analysis at Young War College, and I'm fascinated with this panel for a couple reasons, but primarily about the electric grid. So based on what you just said about having diversity and openness and how we develop capabilities, and then I'm listening to what Melissa Hatfield said in the previous panel about vulnerabilities in the grid, and then Joel, what you said about the sense of we're more vulnerable physically than we are through cyber. Let's talk about the grid. Let's talk about what is a power company's responsibility to ensure that grid goes beyond, say, something that happens in space. I had a conversation with Jim Woolsey earlier this week. Politics set aside, he's concerning, right? I mean, he talks about the power grid. He says it's going to, what happens when that fails, and how that can fail. I just ask you for your thoughts. I'm being a little obsequious here, but I'd ask for your thoughts about what do we need to do, or do we need to do anything, and then maybe calm me down a little bit so I'm not too excited about
Well,
this.
we're going to calm you down here, but close your ears when Ted Koppel is talking to us later.
That's right.
Because that's what sells his books. You want to talk a little about the hype? I'd be happy to address it, but since you're asked it on.
Colonel, are you talking about EMP type attack? Okay. So I think the first thing, and EMP, for those of you who don't understand the term, it's electromagnetic pulse, a high-level nuclear explosion that could take out the electric grid, right? So that's what the Colonel's talking about. I think the first step that we have to take, Colonel, is to fully understand the science around it. Right? We don't know for sure how to protect it if we don't know what the actual threat is. And so a lot of it is theoretical. There are 2 studies being undertaken right now to determine what the actual science is behind that. Once we determine that, and I think the deadlines, Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, is about a year out for the response on both of those studies. So the national labs as well as EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, are sponsoring those. And then we can determine how to protect. So right now, we just don't know exactly what the effects will be, and therefore how to protect against such an attack. But it is something we are taking very seriously. as exemplified by the 2 studies that we've commissioned.
A couple of things on the point. The Congress, of course, is very interested. We just stay within the E&P piece. The government has undertaken a large number of technical studies, but I've been reviewing some of their data. They've installed measurement units, actually surveys to see what our geomagnetic field on the planet actually does if there's a solar burst. We obviously can't let a nuclear device go off over Kansas and measure what it does, so you kind of use your supercomputers at that, but the other threat, solar, which is a similar type of charging up the wires problem. They've not been able to survey the entire United States yet, so they have some data to look at, as Ed's alluding to. The survey started, it forms roughly an arc from approximately North Florida going up through the mid-Atlantic and then hooking to the left and ending over near Seattle. But large portions of the Northeast, New England, have not been surveyed. Large portions of the Mid-America, Texas, points to the Southwest have not been surveyed. Canada has not been surveyed, so Mexico hasn't. So we don't know yet what the atmosphere would do if charged with either a nuclear burst or solar event. We have to have that information. Otherwise, we're throwing good money after that. If we go in and try and harden everything, we don't know what we're hardening against. So there is that science piece that's missing. EPRI is deeply involved in that. That being said, when you first started to answer your question about cyber versus physical, what immediately came to my mind is something I always talk about. The number one thing that turns out lights for you as a customer, if you actually lose power, what's the number, we talked about this when we were at West Point, what is the number one cause of a power loss? Squirrels. Now, we're not out killing all the squirrels, and we tolerate that. And we say it tongue-in-cheek, but it's a fact. More power is lost, new rodents, skunks, snakes, squirrels, whatever that get into the distribution system, but yet we're not hung up on that. We will obsess until we have nightmares at night about mouse clicks, but we have no evidence of any mouse clicky kind of stuff causing distribution outages, much less at the generation or transmission level. And we're not saying it's not a problem. We certainly have to address the problem, but we have to put it in the context of the real threats against the grid do tend to be natural, Mother Earth kind of fighting us with this man-made system. And that's where the resiliency standards come in. This is why your lights stay on. We have built an incredible amount of resiliency into the network because the planet continues to try and attack it, not some mouse-clicking adversary.
Let me add just a couple more points to that. So we do test, for instance, what would happen with the loss of major substation, 2 major substations in an area, and on out to maybe N4, N5, or whatever the utility decides to do. So we do tabletop those things, and we look at it from an all hazards approach. So this could happen, as Marcus was saying, right through natural disaster. We could lose 4 or 5 substations because of a major hurricane. There's no difference to us whether it's a coordinated terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda, who's known to do coordinated attacks, or a hurricane. We've still lost that, so we have to be prepared to address that. And companies tabletop that on a regular basis and how to respond and recover from those kind of things. I've just addressed very quickly the Metcalf attack, the major substation in California that was attacked back in 2013. 12 transformers were shot out. It is the major substation powering Silicon Valley. The result of that, nothing. There was absolutely no loss to
home, no business.
Exactly. Yeah, it was expensive for the company to replace those transformers that were shot out. But as far as the impact to the community, 0.
Joel, do you have a quick comment?
Well, I did, but you guys have, you talked around it, so it was very well done.
Well, unless you do, because I know we've got other questions.
Yeah, let's do another question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's up next?
Hi, I'm Bill Jacobs from Shared Enterprises. We recently went through a series of attacks, as we all know, it's in the media every day. But NASA, I would consider that a tier 1. I think we heard yesterday that there's tier 1, 2, 3 companies and government agencies. And I would think the comment was made that Tier 1 do a little bit better, and I think what we see is they have more resources and more ability to mask what has actually happened to them, as opposed to being better off. Depends on the company and the circumstance. But at NASA specifically, what their firm, principal firm and tool that they use, and I'm not going to mention the name, I don't think it's right or fair, but most of us know who they are. But that set of tools, the suite of tools that NASA employed is precisely the same as many, many government agencies and a number of commercial firms too. And do you think they ought to be used as a model? Would they be willing to do that without suffering too much embarrassment and loss of reputation and so on and so forth? But I think it's really worth looking at and then breaking it down in an after-action in eaches and then compare their suite of tools to other major.
Anytime anybody suffers a loss, we need to understand why. And the lessons learned have to be ingested by others. So that's a short answer. I don't know if you guys want to.
And by the way, I'm the president of my HOA, so squirrels are merely rats with a better publicist.
Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question. Did NASA do a good job or a bad job of, which attack are you referring to?
It was the one, there's a major systems integrator that they employ. I just don't want to mention the name, but they terminated them about a week ago, I believe.
Okay, no, I think I understand. Okay, let's just assume it's a negative. So I think there's a point in there, and that is, are we sharing the type of information that's most useful to a CISO? So the government has made information sharing a centerpiece of the National Cyber Strategy. We've put it into CISA, we've put it into DHS guidelines. We've made a great commercial sector out of information sharing. We've had a number of ISACs that are stood up and make a lot of money information sharing. But as a CISO, I find it really hard to find the kind of information that I can use, and that is, what did they do wrong? I can tell from, I can buy signatures, I can buy some behavioral analysis tools that integrate different approaches to finding the adversary based on IOCs, indicators of compromise. But what I'd like to know is, what did they do wrong? Did they not hire enough people? Did they not pay enough attention to certain alerts? And the reason why I can't get that, at least not in open source, is that it exposes the company to liability. If they publish that type of information, they're inviting plaintiffs' lawyers to come in and sue them, whether they're partners or customers or investors. So I think the point in that is, are we, with this incredibly robust emphasis on information sharing, are we sharing the type of information that is most helpful? There's a lot of sharing on IOCs, but if you look at the Verizon survey, 99%, or maybe depending on whether you look at 2015 or 2016, 99% of known network intrusions were through vulnerabilities that were at least a year old. So sharing IOCs, to me, doesn't seem to be the problem. It's what you do with that information, how you configure your architecture, whether you're deploying enough people, whether you're deploying them properly. Those are the kinds of pieces of information that, if exposed post-breach, potentially expose the company to liability, and that's why we're not getting it. So I think the point in your comment that I'd like to tease out is, despite the emphasis on sharing, I'm not getting the kind of information I really want, and that's what they do wrong.
As a senior decision maker, you
Yes.
need to know that.
So I won't do it.
Without any liability on the
Right.
breach company or whatever, but you still need to know those lessons learned.
Exactly.
Time for one more question.
Can I add one thing to that? So there's a really neat flip side to that. And if you saw General Alexander's talk yesterday, he had the keyword, actionable intelligence, right? And what happens is, I do a lot of work with McAfee, and Dr. Schneck's actually, I think, speaking in one of these concurrent with us today. And we were at a conference, and she explained what happened during the Night Dragon campaign, which McAfee did their big report on that in 2011. And the problem with what they saw was their equipment actually saw the attack. It was able to see the attack progressing through companies. But because of the legal framework that existed, if those were not their customers, they could not notify them that they were being attacked. Because if that information would have ever leaked, it could have had a significant impact on the company's value. Stocks could collapse on them, all kinds of issues around that. So this is kind of why I, even working closely with ICS Cert for me and US Cert, is that with their new AIS platform, they're kind of trying to be very careful about pushing too much of that information out. And they're moving towards this sending out indicators rather than actual what you should do to stop.
Indicators are great for right now, tactical.
Yes,
like,
they
give
are.
me the list of botnet CNCs so I can block them, that's great. But that doesn't help me as an executive to
Right.
build a better program.
It's not a resilient architecture.
Exactly. Let's take one last question, and we're going to have to start wrapping up.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Talley, and I'm going to try to resist singing in this microphone. I'm a human factor psychologist studying human error. And one of the things that I've noticed is that as we harden the network, we still haven't really focused on the human as much as I'd like to see, because that is a whole class of vulnerabilities. And when we talk about vulnerabilities in the network, we almost always talk about technology or the interaction of the human with the technology, but not about the human vulnerability in terms of what they can perceive. And I was just curious about your thoughts about how do you quantify that, or how would you quantify that within your business in terms of risks? And do you ever see any instances where the human vulnerability interacts with perhaps other enterprise class software there to exacerbate a vulnerability within the human? And the case example that I like to present is that, for example, we have social media types of tools that we've allowed in a business to conduct business, to improve efficiency and effectiveness of work that's deeply technical, and yet we're causing an awful lot of a distraction. Everything is buzzing and whistling, and it actually takes their thoughts off of the work and may actually cause a blind spot in their work that an adversary may actually be able to capitalize. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts, or if you've heard of anybody within the CISO community that's starting to think about the technologies that you use for normal business practices and how that might interact with attacks, attack vectors, and the human vulnerabilities, and how you might quantify
Why don't we
that.
start with you, Joel? We'll just make our way back this way.
Yeah, I'll watch the clock and I'll try to do this in 60 seconds. Because I agree, and if you caught what I said very early in this, I believe it is the most serious vulnerability. And it's also the type of vulnerabilities that few organizations are doing anything about. And what's disturbing to me as an assessor and a recommender of change is that they're not even really talked about in best practices. So what happens is, as you bring people in to do threat and risk assessments on organizations, and they tend to focus on technological vulnerabilities rather than soft side vulnerabilities. So that's why what I'm doing personally is developing a lot of methodologies that focus on learning how to identify the human vulnerability. And the best example I always give on that is a firewall. We all know a firewall is a good product, but it is not by itself secure. You have to configure it properly in order for it to be secure, right? So it's the person that configures the device. So if the person doesn't do it right, that secure device is no longer secure. It has nothing to do with the technology of the device. And that's what it's hard to document that. But that's something that I personally am working very heavily on, is to focus on a methodology to understand and identify human weaknesses, not just technological.
Yeah, so I would depart just a little bit from Joel's point and caution senior executives in security from trying too hard to drive the risk presented by users down and the cost that comes with it. And I'll give you a perspective. I had, in my portfolio as an FBI executive, I had cyber and I had special operations. The special operations side was the collection authorities that the FBI had. And I can tell you that I hear training companies, vendors say, we can bring your click rate down from 60% of malicious clicks to 10%. And from an adversary point of view, I love 10% of your workforce clicking on malicious attachments. I love half of 1% clicking. I love one, and I can find that one. So I caution senior executives from falling in love with training programs that claim to drive user risk down too far, because it can distract you from other more beneficial ways of spending security dollars. And like I said before, I like spending on operational excellence, on resilience, and on making my technology agent-proof or employee-proof.
So earlier I mentioned that whenever an employee logs on, they're either an asset or a liability, right? So we recognize that it can go either way with employees. We take steps to address the liability side, again, through training, but also recognizing that employees are not machines, right? That they are human, that they are going to make mistakes. So we try to limit their ability to even make those mistakes. We don't allow our employees to go on to social media, right, from our CDN. We blocked that several years ago. So we've taken some of that noise factor out of their everyday workday. We believe, although I don't have any empirical data around this, that it's made them more efficient because they're not spending, potentially an hour or 2 hours on social media every day unless they want to do it on their own device. So we've tried to help them help themselves, right, by limiting their ability to do bad things, then testing them, but also rewarding them when they do find something. So if they get a suspicious email message comes in, we have a mailbox where they can send that to, that goes to our cybersecurity operations center, and they say, hey, I think this is a suspicious message. The team there will take a look at that and acknowledge first that they've received this, so the employee knows somebody is actually awake, and then they'll respond back to them and say, hey, thank you very much. This did have malware in the attachment, or it didn't, and you can go ahead and open it or not. And so we do both the carrot and the stick approach there and try to help employees help themselves and help their company.
So folks, we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank Ed, Leo, Joel. I'd like to thank all of you for your active engagement. Best panel we've had so far, right? All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks again for making this a great panel. Lots of insight here that we all can hopefully take back to our organizations. On behalf of the ACI and the CCD COE, we would like to present you with a small token of our appreciation.